Many of you will know Nick from the Singularity weblog, from his Singularity podcast series, both of which are incredibly popular. He's a regular presenter and designer of events around the future, and has published a book which many people know called Conversations with the Future, 21 Visions for the 21st Century. Today, he's going to focus with us on a particular theme that he has a passion around, which is our story. He argues that the last time we wrote our story or rewrote our story was with the Industrial Revolution, and that current story now has major fault lines in it, and that we need to create a new visionary, inclusive story that powers us into the future. So we're going to explore those things today. But I'm going to stop talking now, and I'm going to start by asking Nick to introduce himself and tell us a little bit about his own story and how he's got to where we are today.
Oh, wow. I didn't expect that. I'll be talking about my story, but basically my name is Nick. Some of them are Nikola Danaylov. Some of you may know me as Socrates. I'm the host behind what used to be called Singularity One-on-One, and more recently is called Singularity.fm, and the person behind SingularityWeblog.com. Basically, I've been sort of interested in the topic of AI and transhumanism in particular, and the cross between technology and ethics in general since probably 2005 or so, when I was writing my master's thesis. At the time, I wanted to write a thesis called Critical Security at the Intersection of Machine and Human Intelligence. And when I proposed that thesis, people at the Department of Political Science kind of told me I'm in the wrong department because it was so science fiction, so ridiculous, so unrealistic that I would probably not be able to find a supervisor who could supervise me for that thesis. And of course, if you don't have a supervisor, you can't actually have a thesis. It's interesting how for the past 15 or 16 years, things have changed. So that's good. Technology is now a lot more on the forefront of pretty much everything that we do, and especially the ethical implications are coming through and through, not only with respect to artificial intelligence, but genetics, robotics, nanotech, synthetic biology, and 3D printing. And my story basically is a journey of seeking a story that would kind of make sense of my journey and my place in the world, but also of the universe or the cosmos in general, as the Greeks would call it. So that's my story. My story is a journey of me trying to make sense for myself and maybe for others too.
I think that's a brilliant metaphor for the overall theme of the work you're going to talk about, and the challenge that we face as individuals, as communities, as organizations, as nations. I firstly want to apologize to everyone. I've got a streaming head cold, so I think I sound very rough and that I'm gargling with gravel at the moment. So I will every now and then disappear from the screen and from audio just so I can deal with that. I'm not being rude. I just don't want you to see me dealing with it. So let's just jump straight in, Nick. Tell us a little bit more about what you mean by story, what you see our current story as being, the headlines of that, and why you believe it's falling apart.
Well, okay, so maybe we should break it down in two steps. First, what's my thesis? And second, what is a story? Or how is it that I define the term story? Because that has a great bearing. So the thesis, put in one sentence, is basically change your story, change your future. That's my thesis, as simple as that. Now, if we are to elaborate on that, it would be something like, basically, we as human beings and as action takers make decisions and take action not based on facts, not based on evidence, but based on the stories within which we interpreted said facts and said evidence. And based on our story, we often can deny the merit or the validity of evidence and facts, or accept. And so you see, it is not really the evidence and the facts that make us do stuff or not do stuff. It is the story which allows us to interpret the evidence in one particular way or another, as if to inspire us to take or not to take action. And so therefore, my claim is change the story, change the future. And the reason for that is that basically, for as long as a person, organization, or a nation subscribes to the same old story, it would take the same exact action over and over and over again. And if you want them to take a different kind of action, you don't need to supply them necessarily with new facts and new evidence. You need to supply them or find a way to have them reinterpret either the same old evidence within their own story in a new way. But the best way you can do that is if you actually help them change their story, in which way they would be able to take that same evidence they had before, but look at it and interpret it and in a different way get to different conclusions and therefore take different actions. So that's basically the thesis of the book that I'm working on. Now, what is a story? Because that's a very important definition here. Well, a story is information processing technology. That's my definition for a story. And the reason why I say information processing technology is the following. First, it's about information. You see, story, even before we had writing or any other kind of technology, story was always about transferring knowledge or information from one person to another person, from one generation to another generation. So imagine at the time of the Neanderthals or the Cro-Magnons or 80,000 years ago around the cognitive revolution, when the older and more experienced hunter-gatherers had to transmit knowledge, usually around the fire, I imagine, to the newer generation. And they had to do that about the change of the seasons, the best hunting grounds, the best place to find food, shelter, and water, and so on. Well, they did that through story. That was the best way they could do that. And then even after we invented writing, story didn't disappear, but actually became even more powerful, because now, after the invention of writing, story could transcend space and time. And so a story can last for 1,000 years, for many thousands of years, without losing its power. And that's why, by the way, story is different than information. Information is like the daily news. It comes and goes. It's not very long lasting, doesn't have durability. Story can hold its knowledge and its power and its wisdom for 1,000 years and still transmit that energy 1,000 years later. So that's the first thing that story is about, information. Then it's about processing, because it's not just about transferring that kind of particular knowledge or a fact, but it's also about creating a framework within which the giver of the story, or the teller of the story, and the listener and the receiver of the story learns to interpret the whole world and their own place within that world. Learns where we're coming from, who we are, where we're going, what we're supposed to do, what we're not supposed to do, what are the best ways to do it, what are the worst ways to do it, what's the punishment for doing it wrong, what's the benefit for doing it right, and all of those things. All of them come through story. So it's not just about the information, but it's about processing the information. So if you have a bunch of statistics or a bunch of facts, they make no sense. The only way you can understand them properly and to make sense of them is if you put them in a story. That was the birth of history, because before history was born, we had mere chronicles where people kind of like recorded random events without any unifying thread or narrative or a storyline. And so there was no real history. We were talking about chronicles at that time. The moment we started seeing an overarching storyline or overarching narrative through time, through space, with certain goals and ideas and directions, is the moment we gave birth to history. right? So story, the second word, information processing technology. We covered information, we covered processing. Now let's talk about why is it a technology. People would say story is not technology. Well, are you sure about that? So let's first define what is technology. I'll take two definitions, one from Kevin Kelly and another from Angus Fletcher. Kevin Kelly says that story is anything useful invented by the human mind. And Angus Fletcher says that, excuse me, Kevin Kelly says that technology is anything useful invented by the human mind. And Angus Fletcher says that technology is anything useful that allows us to solve problems. So if we are to combine these two definitions together to get to a common definition of technology, a modern one, even though there's an ancient one, and we can go into that one too, which originates from the Greek term techne, but for the purposes of our conversation here today, let's say story is an invention of the human mind that allows us to solve problems. Now, that's technology, excuse me. That's technology. So why story is a technology? Well, you see, story doesn't exist outside of the human mind. It is not a natural artifact of the universe. It only exists in the human mind. So if you take out humans, there are no stories. But when you combine the three words together, information processing technology, you get a definition of a story, which is very useful because it would give us what I think is a profound understanding to interpreting the world. In other words, as Robert McKee said, story is a tool for living. It's a tool that it helps us understand the world around us, helps us understand who we are, where we're going, where we're coming from, and where we're going. I think you're muted, Rohit.
Sorry. Excellent start. I'm very conscious of the time. So I've got about 3,000 questions that I'd love to ask just on the back of that, but I'm going to jump in and keep moving us forward. So without going into too much of the detail of the story yet of today, let's start with the premise that it's falling apart. Why do you see it falling apart today? Why is our overarching narrative under threat?
Well, you see, so the human story has been written and rewritten several times, and perhaps the last time was around the Enlightenment or the Industrial Revolution. And in many ways, that new story was the story of rationalism, the story of scientism, the story of logic, the story that reason, science, and logic would help humanity transcend its animal origins and would kind of create utopia, heaven on earth, if you will. And then in response to that story, by the way, we had first Romanticism in the 19th century, which started pushing immediately against that kind of rationalism and scientism. You even had Freudism to a certain extent. In the 20th century, you had existentialism. Friedrich Nietzsche said a lot of things that went against those ideals. And of course, things eventually like postmodernism and feminism, all of them are a response to that general story. And, you know, that story that we had written during the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution was a fantastic story. And it has brought us where we are today. It has helped us send machines to Mars, to raise the standard of living to unparalleled levels in the history of our civilization. It has helped us break the atom and create the most powerful future possibilities, utopian to a certain degree, even if you will, in front of us. But on the downside, it has created also the most hellish future possibilities in front of us. So for the first time in our history, we were able to completely destroy or wipe out not only ourselves, but all life on our planet. And so a story goes only so far. Stories are like people. They're born, they live, and they die. And they may last for 1,000 years or 10,000 years. Sooner or later, a new story comes and replaces them. My claim is that we are witnessing today this kind of rupture or falling apart of the story, and you can witness that everywhere. The whole 20th century was a clash of three stories: fascism, capitalism, and communism. First, fascism collapsed, then communism collapsed, then capitalism was triumphant. And people proclaimed the end of history and said, look, capitalism is the end of history. This is not only the best story we have ever told, but it's the end of history because it is the best story we can ever tell, period. From here on, we're just going to have one version of capitalism or another. Well, that claim is now manifestly wrong, in my opinion. Even Francis Fukuyama begrudgingly was forced to admit that maybe he wasn't wrong, but his thesis was misplaced, or I forget the word he used, which was like a half acceptance of him being wrong. Anyway, so the question then is, as I said, and story is like a compass. It's like a GPS. It gives us a direction. It tells us where we should go. It tells us how to interpret the facts that we see in front of ourselves. It tells us how to use science to the best purposes possible. And right now it looks like we have a vacuum because the capitalism story is unraveling, but there is no new story, there is no new narrative to fill in that vacuum. So, for example, when we had the Industrial Revolution, we had feudalism as the old story. The old story of feudalism went away. We had the nobility kind of go away. The king became a ceremonial head of state with no real power, or the queen in your case. And then that story basically pushed us for the next 200-300 years. And that was the story of capitalism. Well, it looks like capitalism is at sort of like it's at its end of its usefulness. And it's time for us to replace it with something better.
Great. So, given what you've just said, what kind of story do you think we need, and how do you think our stories might need to be changed going forwards? And tell us a bit about the book that you're sort of evolving, creating, alchemizing at the moment that focuses on this theme of how our story needs to change.
Right. So the book is an experiment. It's a conversation. It's called Rewriting the Human Story: How Our Story Determines Our Future. It's an exploration of that idea. It has three parts. The first part is story, and it basically goes into how story works, how is it defined, what are the basics, and all those things. That's kind of straightforward. The second part, a little bit trickier, is our story. It's about the human story, the science story, the technology story, the capitalism story, the AI story, and the politics story. Those are all stories revolving around our civilization of the past and of present day. And then the third part, and that's the most tricky part by far, is the actual rewriting of the human story. And so, you know, part of the reason for having this conversation is to engage the audience, to engage people, to push forward and maybe even come up with their own answers to the third part of the book. Because that last third part of the book may take me years, if not decades. And I don't have a deadline because I will only finish that part when I'm happy with it. And I'm not happy with it at the moment. And so there's three or two parts, let's say major parts, to answer your question. So first of all, it's the process of writing the story of the future. And secondly, several possible versions of it. So the process of writing the story of the future is very tricky because one of the claims I make in that third part is that a single story is very dangerous. You see, in the previous part, I explained the biology of story and the psychology of story and how we are biologically and psychologically wired for story. And that's very good in certain ways. But also, that's a shortcoming. That's very bad because if someone comes and exploits that, hacks that kind of a biological feature of us, we can easily be manipulated. And people have done that in the past, whether you're talking about Nazism, or whether you're talking about any positive that we would judge or negative movement in the world, is basically a story, whether it's communism, capitalism, fascism, feminism, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, Brexit, Buddhism. All of those are stories. And so there is a huge danger of a single story. And so one of the features of the story of the future is that it cannot be a single story. So it can be a single story that allows space for other stories which are kind of incompatible or hard to fit with its own self. And that makes it very tricky, right? And also, if you look at it from a biological point of view, the strength of biology and evolution is diversity. And if you don't have diversity, if you have homogeneity, then you risk collapse, because a single thing, a single danger can wipe out a whole ecosystem. The same applies to stories or people who embrace those stories. So the more diversified our story outlook it is for the future, the better chance of survival we have. So now the trick is, how can we make them peacefully coexist? And here, the answer, at least in part, would be, and I'm borrowing a little bit from our friend David Wood and many other thinkers, political thinkers, is the story of politics. Because what is politics? Politics is the story that creates the framework and that regulates how we do things together as a community. How anytime when you have more than one person, a group of people, a community, a city, a nation, or a civilization, how they do things together. That's what politics is all about. And it creates the framework and the rules. So it's a story about the rules. And in a way, politics is like the story that if you accept that story, that's to say the rules, then that's the biggest battle that you have won. And one example that's given often by Yuval Noah Harari is the World Cup. The football, as you call it in England, we call it here soccer in North America. But either way, all countries that participate in the World Cup accept the rules, even if they have diametrically opposed interests and it's winner-take-all scenario. So Brazil may hate the fact that Germany wins, and may really, really hate that fact, but they do not deny the legitimacy of the German win, because everyone accepts the same rules. And why is that the case? Because they all accept the story of soccer as a game. And so the key is, can we come with a political story which would be very important part of the foundation of our civilization? And if a civilization falls apart, it is because its political story falls apart. And actually, there was a Dutch scientist in the 1960s who did a historical overview of all the great historical empires. And he made two conclusions. The first one is that empires die from suicide, not from murder. And the second one is the importance of the image of the future. An empire, or a group of people, a polity, if you want to call it, thrives for as long as there is a compelling, positive story, or what he calls image of the future. The moment that story loses its appeal and starts not being accepted on a wider basis by the population, is the moment you start seeing the first cracks of that polity, and it eventually leads to its collapse. And so the future story, and that's my kind of concluding sentence here, is very tricky because it cannot be a single story. It cannot be written by a single person. Probably it cannot be written by a single sex. Not probably, surely it cannot be written by men for men. It has to be written by men, women, trans people of all kinds, etc. Probably it cannot be written by a single species because it will be only one story. But we know that in the near future, we may peacefully have to coexist with artificial intelligences, with cyborgs, with transhumans, who knows, maybe even with alien intelligences. And the only way we can do that is if and only if our story allows space for their own stories to fit within that general story. And that's why it makes it so hard, and I'm struggling with it so much, right? So it has to be a unifying story and consistent, and yet allow those clearings, those empty spaces for all those other narratives to thrive without destroying the overall unity of that story.
Excellent. So many questions again. I'm going to pick a couple that I want to pick on.
Sure.
There's quite a few coming through. Right now, we have a kind of huge emotional attachment. Different people have a huge emotional attachment to our current stories, whether they're the political story, life, how we live it, our right to earn money, our right to dominance over technology. And what happens when that attachment actually retards our progress or holds back certain sections of society?
Extinction.
Is that inevitable, or can we evolve in a way that we do have these multi-tier societies that just go on, but the top and the bottom grow and everyone else has to move one way or the other?
Well, the claim I made was that story is a tool for living. It's a compass, it's a GPS. If your GPS is out of date and the location you're at is not represented or captured, let's say the map has constantly changed. Let's say Toronto is the fastest growing city in North America. We have more construction cranes on the Toronto skyline than all of North America combined together, okay? So that means that if you have an old GPS, when you're driving around the Toronto streets, you're obsolete. You can't find your address. So that tool, which was very useful a couple of years ago, is now useless. Not only that, but it might be dangerous in certain situations because at best it could take you to a dead end. In some cases, you may end up in Lake Ontario. And so take that at the sort of civilization-wide level. As I said, a story is a compass to the future. It points the direction. It tells us where we're coming from, who we are, and where we're going. It tells us people like us do things like this. It tells us this is right and this is wrong. It tells us we should do this and we should do it that way. It's very useful, but as I said, its usefulness has a lifespan. And once that lifespan is over, if you're stuck holding to your own story, you're going to be in trouble. Let me give you some real example. My wife was just sharing a story this morning with me about a friend of hers, or someone who knew, who is this very fit 45, 50-year-old guy who suddenly discovered he has stage 4 cancer. And he was sharing that the hardest thing of all was not the chemotherapy and all the other things. The hardest thing of all was him dealing psychologically with the story of being sick. Because all his life, his story has been, I am super healthy, I am super fit, I don't need help, I give help. This is who I am. And now when the story has changed, he suddenly doesn't know who he is. And this is very clear, for example, with soldiers or other personnel, firemen. Soldiers go off to war and their whole identity is wrapped up into the warrior story. I'm a warrior, I'm a soldier. They go to war, they get blown up to pieces, they come back injured, they cannot be a soldier anymore. They have to retire for medical reasons. The toughest part is not the medical, physical part, it's the psychological part. And the reason why many people commit suicide is because they fail to embrace or to find the new story that gives meaning to who they are, that gives meaning to their life, and that gives them a direction for the future. So if you find a new story that serves you, that gives you meaning, that gives you direction, you become aimless, you become suicidal and destructive, but potentially not only to yourself, but possibly the people around you. And ultimately, I believe that one way or another, it's not a positive story from then onwards.
Great. So I want to combine a question that we've got from David with one of my own. Right now, there's a number of people who kind of acknowledge that we need a new story, but they're positing the answer. They're saying that the new all-encompassing story for humanity is next generation capitalism, it's green technology, it's active transhumanism, it's decentralized economies.
Cryptopia.
It's Cryptopia or whatever, or we're all going to live in the metaverse, God forbid. But that there is this view that we're already trying to find the answer before we've even worked out the question of, well, what benefits would an overarching narrative for society have? We're trying to answer what the solution would be. Do you think we can have one? And what would the benefit of having some single overarching narrative be to pull us all together? Does it have some benefits?
Absolutely. So let me start backwards then. Let me start with the benefits. The benefits are that we would have a story has an embedded mechanism for conflict resolution. That's the benefit. Because think about it this way. If we refuse to accept the legitimacy of a story, then we refuse to accept the rules that we play by. And then it's a free-for-all. Anything is possible, dirty tricks or whatever. But if we accept that we're all playing soccer and or football for the World Cup, then there is conflict. There is very hot passions. There is incompatible interest. But one way or another, there is a conflict resolution mechanism embedded into the story, which grants legitimacy. As long as that mechanism is allowed to play itself out, it grants legitimacy to the outcome, even the outcome being suboptimal, or the outcome being not what individual players wanted. And the benefit is that it may not be the case that Brazil wanted Germany to be number one, but all players are better off together playing the same game under the same rules, rather than each playing separate game with separate rules against each other. So you may not get the individually most optimal outcome for Brazil or for Canada or for the UK, but you get the most positive equilibrium for all participants. And that's particularly important in a world where we would have artificial intelligence, genetics, robotics, nanotech, synthetic biology, 3D printing, cryptos, blockchain, NFTs, you name it, weapons of mass destruction that, I don't know, people might be able to print out in their own home garages and so on. So I think that's the benefit. The benefit is that our civilization can survive and thrive, because without it, our civilization cannot stand. As I said, politics is the story about the rules of the game. You don't accept the rules of the game, it's a disaster. We're not playing soccer, it would be live combat, right? And the damage, in soccer, we can kick each other, we can push each other, I can headbutt you maybe sometimes if the referee is not looking, but I'm not gonna come with a AK-47 at you, So there's a limit to the violence, there's regulations, and there's a conflict resolving mechanism embedded. So there's a huge benefit, especially in the 21st century, when for the first time in our civilization, we can populate the universe. We can spread throughout the stars like Carl Sagan and now Elon Musk is dreaming of. The downside is if we don't do that, we can go the way of the dinosaurs. And that would happen for sure, in my opinion, if we refuse to change our story. Because look, this is where we are today, COP26. We are stuck to the old story of coal and a bunch of other old stories. And if we continue holding them, we're like a monkey with a hand in a coconut holding something. We are trapped, and our stories are going to be our chains, and they're going to be our downfall. So we have to break them and write new stories that would give us a new direction for a new future.
So interested that you mentioned COP26, because for me, that was an example of a few different attempts we have right now to create a common narrative. And arguably, none of the world leaders now would publicly say, we shouldn't deal with climate change or we shouldn't deal with emissions. They would all acknowledge it, but they all have their own stories. So you take India and China, they know how slow the process is of change, which is why they've pushed the number out way beyond anyone's imagination to say, we'll phase out coal by 2060, 2070. You might as well say by the year 4000, you know, how far they've pushed it. But the thing is, we're not seeing the underlying story then of what the steps are. The same is true of the Sustainable Development Goals. We now have the UN's Common Agenda, which, as far as I can see, is a vague rewriting of the Sustainable Development Goals in a less comprehensible manner, with some complex relationship between them. In order to get to that universal dialogue, or that kind of universal overarching framework that says, this may not benefit everyone individually, but there's a collective agreement that we're going to benefit us all as a planet. It feels like there's a set of steps to get us there, that we can't get there in one stage. There's a process of changing hearts and mindsets. Talk a little bit to what some of those enablers might be to getting to some greater alignment.
The same thing I've been talking about, story. The reason why China and India are acting the way they are is because they're not accepting the climate change story as their primary story. Okay, so there's a gradation or ranking of story. We're each individually and collectively a strange concoction of multiple stories. That's how our individualities are created. That's how our identities are built. That's how our national ethos is built, and so on. India and China's story that they put higher value on rather than the climate change story is capitalism. And capitalism can be captured in a single word. The whole story of capitalism is captured in one word story: growth. If you stop growth, capitalism doesn't hold, it collapses, right? You cannot, in capitalism, you cannot hold growth. You need constant growth. It may be 0.5%, it may be 0.001%, but you need more tomorrow than what you had today. That's what capitalism is all about. Otherwise, you don't have investment. And if you don't have investment, the whole system collapses, right? And so India's and China's problem is that their highest ranking story is not climate change story, it's capitalism. And they say, okay, climate change is all nice and good, but growth is more important to us. And so if you want them to change their action, you have to make them change their story. And that's why I'm saying that hanging on to the old story is suicidal, because if you now hang on to that old story of growth, the way we used to grow in the first world with coal and all those things, and now China and India wants to repeat that path, that's a recipe for disaster. And maybe even climate suicide in a way, if you will, right? And so we have to find a way to help them change the ranking of their story, so that the climate story, and I'm not convinced that the climate story would be the story. Just like I used to think that transhumanism might be the story that unites humanity, I'm now convinced that's absolutely not going to be the case. It will be part of the story, just like artificial intelligence, technology, climate change, cryptos, all of those things will be part of the story. They would not be the story. They will be just subplots at best.
Excellent. I'm very conscious of time. So firstly, are you willing to stay on afterwards for a few minutes to have a discussion with whoever wants to? Because what we'll do is we'll open it in, we'll make everyone a panelist who wants to stay and have a chat, and then I'll shut up. But so before we kind of have a formal close, let's just sort of try and wrap it up a little bit with what do you think is the unique contribution you can make through this book, and how would you measure its success in doing that?
Right. So the unique contribution that I'm trying to make here is that my work would help us focus on not a specific story per se, but on the process of story and the importance of story in general as the main feature that comprises our human civilization. In the book, one of the claims I make in the chapter on technology, for example, just like in the chapter of science, I say, what is the most important technology in the history of our civilization? Some would say it's the wheel, others would say it's the internet, others would say it's cryptocurrencies. There's many candidates. I would say the most important technology is story, because you can have a civilization without the wheel. You can have a civilization without cryptos. You can have a civilization without the internet, and many have existed. But you cannot have a civilization without a story, because a story brings people and puts them together. That's it. That's the feature that makes us from individuals into a community and into a civilization. You remove that feature, everything falls apart. And so my unique contribution is to help bring forth the importance of story, how crucially important it has been in the past and it will be in the future, to start a conversation of rewriting the story, to put forth several versions there of myself, but also with that conversation, inspire others to take it from there and maybe come up with better versions for that story. And how would I measure it? There's only one way you can measure the successfulness of a story. A story is like a virus. There is only one way you can measure it. Does it spread or does it not spread? If a story spreads, it's successful. And how do you know that? Well, when you tell that story to somebody, do they feel immediately compelled to turn around and tell that story to somebody else? Because that's what happened to many people when the internet was invented. They could not hold themselves, but had to share this crazy idea called the internet. That's what other people felt when computers were invented. That's what other people felt when I felt that way when I discovered the idea of the technological singularity and the idea of transhumanism. I felt compelled to tell that to everybody I met. And most recently, people have felt the same way with the invention of blockchain and cryptocurrencies. That's how you know those stories are viral, they're infectious, and they're spreading. And stories that spread don't just win, they change the world. And we need a story like that. So that's the only way you can measure success. Is it infectious? Is it viral? Is it spreading throughout culture like a wave? Anything short of that is insufficient, because we have no time, and we have fundamental challenges coming our way.
Nick, thank you so much. It's been, I wouldn't call it a conversation, as I've said very little, but it's been fascinating to hear you talk about these topics. As I say, we could go on, but thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. What I'm going to suggest now is we'll take a 2-minute comfort break to allow those that want to leave. And then we've got questions from David Wood, a question from David Prokhorov, and others in the panel. I've seen a lot of comments here and David sharing a lot of links. So we're going to make everyone part of the conversation. Then we'll just get people's views, questions for Nick, discussions with each other. Let's just take a couple of minutes and restart at in 4 minutes time at 7:50 UK time. 4 minutes from now, give you all to have a chance to have a quick comfort break.
Okay.
Grab a glass of water and I can go and blow my nose, and we'll see you all shortly.
Cheers.
Well, it's a point that's often raised. Many people are saying about COP, it's a failure because it did not decide to cancel capitalism. People are saying there's no solution for climate so long as capitalism exists. But I don't think that's entirely the case. I think that capitalism is itself a broad thing. And there are many invaluable aspects of freedom inside capitalism which we should preserve. And it's more to the point is how do we mold and steer and harness capitalism? How do we ensure that we are measuring all its side effects properly when we are taking decisions about what constraints to put on companies? So I would like to offer as a counterexample, rather than saying we need to stop the story of capitalism, we need to advance particular elements of the broad framework within capitalism. What do you think, Nikola, about the idea of the mixed market as being one of the most important stories? Because I would agree with some economists who and political scientists who have said that actually the single most important invention of the last 200 years is the mixed market, which seeks to get the best out of capitalism but constrains it. And the unfortunate thing that's happened in the last 50 years or so is that some right-wing ideologues, neoliberals, have gone around telling everybody that political interference in capitalism is always bad and terrible and should be resisted, whereas in reality, capitalism has done its best with wise democratic oversight, and we need more of it. And if we can do that, we can solve climate change by taking advantage of green capitalism, rather than having to jam on the brakes and have no freedoms and no growth anymore. So that's my opener, Nikola. What do you think about green growth and the mixed market as being key parts of the next story?
So look, David, as you know, I was born behind the Iron Curtain in communist Bulgaria in 1976. So for 14 or 15 years of my life, I lived communism. Let me tell you, the reason why I live in Canada today is because on any day of the week, I would rather live in a capitalist democracy than in a communist dictatorship of the proletariat. That's a fact. But that's a relative benefit or advantage. It's not an absolute one. So the story of capitalism is better, for me especially, as opposed to the story of communism for me again. But and we can talk about how the story of capitalism can adapt, and we can take certain elements of that story into the future, and markets or mixed markets may be one of them. But ultimately, here's the problem at the sort of the meta level, at the macro level, at the sort of the philosophical level, if you will. The problem with capitalism is the same as the problem with science, and that is that they're both reductionist in nature. So just like science reduces our universe to the physical world, that's to say physics, capitalism reduces our world or our universe to the market or to its monetary value, that's to say money. So it tells us how much something is worth as derived from the stories we tell about it, right? And from then on, you have a whole ranking of the world in general. In other words, the market values the whole universe. And so once you embrace the market, the benefit is what you said. The cost is that China and India can justify the market, in their view, to put the market above the priority of the climate change urgency.
I agree with you that actually capitalism cannot be the ultimate goal, and just as science cannot be the ultimate goal. We need a bigger picture, and that's what's missing, which is the bigger story, which I offer as transhumanism, as you know, as I think active transhumanism has the ability to revolutionize people's thinking around the world. All I would say is we should not be saying, let's not have science, and we should not be saying, let's not have the capitalism. We should be saying, let's have the right frameworks in which we can take wise advantage of science, and the right frameworks in which we can take wise advantage of regulated, steered capitalism.
Exactly, and that's my point. So we need a story that can utilize and regulate, create a framework for the best of science, the best of capitalism, the best of politics, the best of technology, the best of ethics, all of it, the best of democracy, the best of allowing almost mutually exclusive stories to peacefully coexist together and to have a conflict resolving mechanism embedded in it where the legitimacy of the outcome is accepted by everyone, even if they find that that outcome is not optimal for their own individual, personal, or collective interests.
So to that point, can I just jump in there where so we talk about defining the best of, and if we go back to the analogy we were talking about earlier with football, we have maybe 200 nations in the world subscribing to the game and a set of rules, and willing to play it roughly within those rules, although there's an incredible amount of bending going on now with drugs and all sorts of things. But we've got a fascinating situation there where we have the rules, we have the governing body who effectively oversees those rules, whose credibility has never been more challenged. It's seen as a corrupt organization, it's seen as incompetent, blah, you put whatever adjective you want in there. And so the question is, if we try to do this going forward, who gets that right of being the supreme core of what's best of technology, humanity, transhumanism, all of those things? Who gets to judge? Who gets to make the rules? Who gets to determine the ranking of different components within that system?
That's why it's so tricky, because one of those should not have the power to judge over the others necessarily, but they all have to peacefully coexist. That's the tricky part. That's why that story of the future is so hard to come by, because you need a story that all accept, a story that all of them individually will get less than what their best desired outcome, a story which collectively would give everyone the best equilibrium together, not individually, and a story which allows for the peaceful coexistence of mutually exclusive conflicting interests and sub-stories. That's why it's so hard, and that's why I'm struggling with it so much, and that's why, as I said, I may or may not even be able to complete this task. May be arrogant of me to think that I can even begin it, maybe Sisyphean, but if at least if I've started the conversation and someone else picks up from here onwards and comes up with it, and by the way, there was a question there about leadership in the comments I quickly saw, and this is the greatest leadership opportunity in the 21st century. In my opinion, there is no bigger leadership opportunity, because the leader who tells that story or comes up with that story, doesn't have to be that they came up with it, but tells it in a compelling way to create that movement, to create that wave that we require of change, would be the leader that would be the leader of the 21st century and the leader of humanity as a civilization, maybe for the first time in the history of our species, because previously our leaders have been always kind of national or local, but now for the first time we have an opportunity for a leader of humanity, of our species, of our planet.
We have I've been trying to promote everyone to panelists. Not everyone's made it there, and I'm not sure why. So if you want to be a panelist, just put a comment.
Jane Edwards is raising her hand, I think, so we should bring some female voices. You see,
the future
cannot be dominated by men, white men especially.
I can't see your hand, Jane, but are you, where are you? Oh, there you go, Diane Edwards, sorry. Diane, please speak, you're unmuted.
Hi, I've just put my video on. Thank you, Nikola. It's been a really fascinating morning, and sorry, it's morning here, I'm in New Zealand.
Oh, wow.
I can't wait to read your book. It's really interesting. And this is not so much a question, but an observation that I think what makes this such a challenging topic is that it operates both at the macro and the micro level. We talk about leaders in this big, wide sense, but at the end of the day, they are people. And for them to be able to change, my own job is as a change manager in organizations, and we work with stories all the time. How do you reinvent the story of the organization? But you don't necessarily only work with the leaders. You actually have to work with the grassroots as well. And I think that when you're trying to balance both that macro view and that micro view, that's where the challenge lies.
Yes, that absolutely is part of the challenge. Of course, the challenge is bigger than that. So let me give you a couple of examples. So one is the limited sex example that or gender, I should call it, that we have limited gender representation, for example. And so and I have a chapter in the third part which I'm working on, which is called Women and the Other Storytellers. And basically it starts with two quotes, one about the gender gap and one about the species gap. And the first quote goes like this: "History isn't what happened, it's who tells the story." Right? And that's why it's called history, not her story. Because it's him, he told the story, not her. Always a guy, always a white guy usually. And he, right? That's why we call it history. Second quote: "Until the lion learns how to write, every story will glorify the hunter." African proverb. That's about the species gap that we need to address, right? So we have stories that glorify the hunter, the killing of the lion, or corrida, the Spanish corrida, go kill the bulls. I am such a man, you see, I just killed a bull. Okay, but until someone tells the story of the hunt from the point of view of the lion, we'll never get equal representation of the lions and hear their story. And maybe their story is the real or more interesting story, the real heroic story. One where a lion has to go and fight with a hunter who has night vision goggles and an optical sight and basically cannot miss the shot from 1.5 miles away from the lion, right? And so these are things we have to overcome. The gender gap is a huge gap for us, but it's a small step in the general scheme of things, because we are going to have bigger problems with other species, with transhumans, with cyborgs, with artificial intelligence, maybe even with alien intelligences. And we have maybe animal uplift, which is to say animals which could have the cognitive capacity of humans in one way or another. So, Iris, how about
yes,
Iris?
so sorry that I have not been there. I'm just jumping in. I was only at the end of this call. So, but I like to pick up when Diane, now the women are coming, Diane was saying something. Really, I think as well, it is very dangerous even if there are human leaders for a large number of people, and the grassroots is so important. And what's happening in Switzerland, there is literally a grassroots movement, very local groups, yes, and they let leadership crumble at the moment, because I think leadership, the concept of leadership really is crumbling, and we should allow it to crumble, and then really, with not knowing, find a new communitarian way, finding new functions. Of course, we need to lead, but not the leader. And so that could be very dangerous. And we know that the technocracy is leading us very much so. And I dare to say some tyranny in it. And so really simplify, going to the communities, and from there building up anew. That's my view at the moment.
And maybe the future of leadership is leaderless.
Yes, exactly.
Maybe it's decentralized. And when I say leader, what I really mean is storyteller. That's what I mean. I mean someone who tells the story. That's as far as I mean leader. Not in the classic sense of the term leader, but in the new sense of a storyteller. But if the story is not told by a single person, single gender, single species, and it has all these clearings and spaces for different kind of stories within that story, then it becomes a kind of a very fluid, decentralized mosaic of stories.
And where
So
do the stories come from?
that's the visual sort of concept that I have of it. but I haven't been able to quite nail it down on paper, to be honest. I'm
I
very far
just,
from it.
I'm not challenging you, but I'm challenging the human species, because we are full of, we are over the science of image, we could say, is distorted. And I'm quite provocative at the moment, but I think really emptying out, listen to nature, and then finding new storytelling, maybe not new stories, but new way of storytelling, because we are full of the old habits. I like storytelling. It is really, I like that approach very much. And so, but where does the story come from?
I think we also have a huge amount to learn from Indigenous cultures. In New Zealand, which is a bicultural country, so we have our Māori culture sitting side by side with what is essentially a European culture imported. There's a huge amount you can learn from the way that Māori, for example, measure in generations, not in years, that they look at the world as being a custodian, not a consumer. And yet they are not these poor little natives sitting in huts. They are full participants in society who have used technology, who are developing AI for their own purposes, but within a completely different paradigm. And I think we still, going back, Nikola, to your comment around more women, it's also about getting more alternative cultures. And I say alternative because there's lots of cultures within Europe, but they are years and light years apart from many of the indigenous cultures. And there's so much that they can teach us.
Oh, yeah.
Jabir, I know you were waiting to come in, and then I know Mubarak is waiting to come in too.
Dr. Nikola, I'm very interested in the story of religion, because I'm realizing now that when I go to the mosque and hear the imams, talk about my religion is Islam, and what I hear is they narrate the story that this what happened in history or Islam. So basically, what they're narrative is what happened. This happened, this happened, this happened. But in that narrative, what is missing in that story narrative is the discussion of, there's no narrative as to why that thing happened, or, why that event happened, or, that event happened, what happened. But the reason that what happened was this reason at the back. But now that I'm sort of looking into that, when you start looking at the why that event happened, or why that what happened, completely a new understanding opens up. That's number one. And when you look at the religious story from different perspective, or different perspective and different knowledge, all right? Like, you look at from the mathematic perspective, you look at innovation, because I'm a specialist in innovation. I'm looking at my own religion from innovation perspective, and I'm getting a complete different narrative as what my religion tells me. And I myself is like, wow, and nobody's even like discussed that. And I can bring the whole religion of, basically any religion to one formula or one algorithm, and this is it. I mean, that is from the narrative perspective of bringing an innovation framework. So what is your take on that, the story of religion?
So the story of religion has been historically one of the most powerful stories in the history of humanity. Whether it's Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, or Buddhism, or Hinduism, those are stories that the majority of the human race subscribes to. Like, I'm an atheist, or at best, on the best days, agnostic myself, but I can respect the fact that most people on our planet are not like me. So that's one of the most powerful story, and it's a very useful story for people because it carries a lot of knowledge. All of the religions, one of the reasons why they've been so popular is because they do contain wisdom, and they do contain a handbook of how to deal with your daily life. Islam in particular is very specific. It tells us where you're coming from, who you are, where you're going, how you should live your life, who you should marry, what is not allowed, what is allowed, why you shouldn't eat pork, why you shouldn't drink alcohol, you know, who should be your friend, how you should treat your mother, how you should treat your father, how you should treat your wife, your kids. Everything is told to you in that story. Now, here's the problem. The greatest strength is the greatest weakness, usually. And that is true of religion, and that's true of science. But let's talk about just religion here for the moment. So, if you're stuck with those answers that religion gives you, they may be very useful answers for 1,000 years. But sooner or later, answers go obsolete. So you see, the questions that we ask as individuals and as communities and as civilizations have a lot longer lifespan than the answers. The answers may last hundreds of years, the questions may last forever. And every time a new answer to the same age-old question is given, we have a political, social, and maybe even religious revolution. So for example, Islam in the 7th century or thereabouts was a reaction to all those geopolitical and religious situations around the Middle East. And then it literally conquered the world, you know, Northern Africa, Southwestern Europe, Spain, all the way, you know, to the Indian Ocean. And it was a very progressive, very scientific and very kind of fast forward looking religion. It was the best, most advanced answer for its day. Then 300 years later, you know, one of the big empires aspiring to that religion was called the sick old men of Europe, the Ottoman Empire, and it collapsed because the answers that used to provide, you know, meaning to those people and daily guidance and a compass to how those people would address the world expired and were no longer useful. And so the greatest strength becomes their greatest weakness. And so to me, this is the difference between religion and open-mindedness, is doubt. Religion starts with faith. Everything, whether it's Christian religion, Muslim religion, Hinduism, if you don't believe the basic dogmas, you're not of that faith, obviously. You know, Islam starts with there is only one God and his name is Allah, right? And I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing it or saying it wrongly, but it's a monotheistic religion. It has a certain political and social implication. It unites people around a story, and that makes them very powerful. They can conquer politically the world, and they almost did. They went all the way to Vienna, right? And so, but then this answer stops being useful, and this is where my strength comes in, and my strength is doubt. Because every time you're given an answer, you're given a handbook. The benefit is that you don't have to think. You have all the answers to the end of time to you. Who you are, where you're coming from, how to live the good life, etc. And you never need to question those because that means you're not following the book. And the book was written by God. But to me, doubt allows you to adapt to a changing situation and to a changing environment and come up with a better answer to the same old question. And that allows you to adapt, that allows you to evolve, and that allows you to make progress and to be better. And so religion, just like all the other movements, will inevitably have to adapt. And it will, I have no doubt. Religions have been around for, in some cases, 3,000 years almost, or 2,500 years, like Buddhism and Judaism is older. So, and one of the reasons they have been able to survive for so long is because they have adapted in one way or another. And if they stop adapting, they will go obsolete. And history is full of ancient religions that used to be the peak of their days. Zeus and the whole Greek pantheon, and you know, Jupiter, the Romans basically stole it from the Greeks. But anyway, those gods are all dead now. And the reason is because they have almost nothing to tell us today about who we are, where we're coming from, and where we're going. And if modern religions like Islam, Christianity, and Buddhism don't find a meaning to that question and meaning, don't give us meaningful answers, they would go obsolete too. So they will have no choice but to adapt.
I want to bring in, we've got hands up from Mubarak, from Roy, and Cynthia's been making some very interesting points. I'd love to bring the three of you in. Let's try and go for short questions, relatively short answers, so we can get a number of people in. I'm thinking we might stop around 8:30, unless the conversation wants to flow on beyond that. Mubarak, what would you like to contribute?
Good morning and good evening to one and all. Thanks, respected Nichols. Thanks for your invaluable insights, and extending my thanks to Rohit for this opportunity. And hope you are doing well, sir. And take care of and consult the doctor first, please. Okay. Before asking my question, I wish to start the quote from James Eder. What stories do? They make children go to sleep and soldiers go to war. I'm repeating once again. They make children go to sleep and soldiers go to war. My questions to Nikola. Tell us about one of the most inspiring, compelling recent research that explains why stories are important for leadership and influence. Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity.
My pleasure, my friend. I'm not sure I could hear the entirety of your question. Why stories are so important to leadership?
Recent research. Why stories? Tell us about one of the most compelling recent research that explains why stories are important for leadership and influence.
And resilience. Right. Okay. So first of all, stories are the most powerful thing I know of, because stories would make us kill and die for. You know, we live in a world where people kill each other. We kill each other over our stories. You know, unfortunately, one person kills another because you're a Jew and I'm a Muslim and I'm a Christian fundamentalist and, you know, I'm a Sikh separatist or whatever. Those are the story that people kill for. And, or, you know, World War I, World War II, fascism, you name it. There's always a certain story you must have if you want to make one person kill another person or another person die for something. Without the story, you can't make people do anything. And there's many reasons for that. So one of them is biological. We are wired for story. Biologically, we're wired for story, and we don't quite understand why that works. And it's a fascinating research, but when you think of it, you see, what is a placebo? Placebo is a story about a drug that you thought you took, but you never did. And yet, 35% of the time, give or take, you exhibit the benefits of the drug without taking the drug. Now, how is that possible in a scientific world that we live in, right? You're supposed to have a cause and effect, a physical cause over a physical effect. In 35% of the cases, you did not have the physical cause. People did not take a drug, they took a sugar pill, and yet they exhibited all kinds of improvements, medical improvements that we can measure scientifically. How is that possible, right? So what is a placebo? Placebo is a story. So we are wired for story neurobiologically. We create the world in our minds by telling ourselves a story inside. So it's not that the brain or the mind is a mirror of the environment outside of our heads. It's the primary creator of it. That's a crucial point to understand. It's a primary creator. It's not a mirror, because we don't take everything and reflect it. We take selective slice of reality to reflect it inside. Evolutionarily selective. Now, leadership. The way I like to put it is this: leaders tell uncomfortable, unreasonable, and politically incorrect stories. That's how you know they're leaders. Take one of my favorite leaders, or I'll give you two of my favorite leaders of all time, Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. Gandhi. So first, he was, you know, unreasonable. Why? Because he told the British, I'm gonna make you pick up your stuff and leave India without a national revolution without violence, without defeating you militarily on the battlefield. When he told them that was his goal and that was his plan, they nearly laughed him out of the room because that was kind of obscenely ridiculous statement to make. It was utterly unreasonable. Britain was a military power, one of the greatest in the world, if not the greatest. The whole idea was preposterous that someone would peacefully make them pick up and leave. So he was unreasonable. That was his story. His story of peaceful independence of India was unreasonable. Secondly, it was uncomfortable because it made both himself and his followers put their lives on the line in belief of that story and in belief of the fact that it's possible to be accomplished. And he stood on that line himself, right? Many times, and eventually got shot and killed. Anyway, not by the British, of course, but that's a whole other story. And finally, leaders are politically incorrect because they're always going against the dominant paradigm. So the dominant paradigm of his day, whether when he was in South Africa or whether later in India, was basically a state, a racist state in South Africa or a semi-racist state of India colonized, I mean, of UK, of Great Britain Empire colonizing India. And so it was politically incorrect to go against the power of the day. And so that's where the story of the leader comes to play. It's unreasonable, it's uncomfortable for everyone, it's politically incorrect. And finally, for it to make a difference, it has to be viral. It has to spread, people have to take on it. And as you said, my friend, they have to be willing to die for it, if not to kill for it.
Okay, what I'm going to do now, this is such a fascinating conversation, but I suspect we have to let people go at some point. Roy made a point, Cynthia's made some interesting points, Jens has made interesting points, Iris has made interesting points in the chat. So what I'm going to do is just go around and give each of you a chance to say something, raise a question, make a comment, and then Nikola can respond to everything he's heard with a sort of final summation of his thoughts, and then we'll let people go. Roy, why don't you go first?
Sure, and I have to apologize. I do have a hard stop in 5 minutes. I just wanted to comment about or hear what you think about belief as a power, right? I mean, at the end of the day, all of our global monetary system is a belief system. There's nothing physical holding it. A dollar's worth a dollar because we agree it is. And effectively, all of that belief is based on power, right? I mean, the reason China shuts down Bitcoin is not because they don't like blockchains, it's because it's about power and they hold the power at the moment, you know. And I'm just curious, I was in a debate recently where I was debating one side that, let's just say it was more science fact based, and every question I got was a belief question. And there's no way to debate. You can't debate belief with fact. Like, that's just not and functionally, I think that's the problem the US is having. That's what Brexit was about. You've got facts versus beliefs, and all the facts people are like, but facts, and the belief people are like, yeah, so I don't understand. And anyway, I just want to hear what you have to say about that, but unfortunately, I'm probably going to have to depart before you get to. Thank you. It was very interesting.
Cynthia, do you want to come in?
Oh, thank you. I'm basically in the chat, but I'm particularly interested in history, being inclusive of non-human animals, and that's my primary concern in our stories.
Okay. Jens.
Yep. So I was thinking about the boundaries of your story and limitations, which helps us to create, the space. First off, I was thinking about, we're living in this environment on this planet, and then you were talking about interplanetary and intergalaxy, perhaps. Where do you draw the line? Because if you want to do this in a lifetime or two, there has to be some boundaries, right?
Iris. You're muted, Iris.
Yes. I just read again Roy's comment, much comes down to laziness. People don't want to educate themselves and make their own decisions. And I think in this time where fake news and it's so disorienting, so that first really come back to our own intuition and perceptions and rethink and refeel, that would be really a good start, I think, for everything which builds up from there in communities.
Sven, we haven't heard from you. Is there anything you wanted to add, or comments or questions that you had?
If I may, yes, I have two rather short. Hi, Nikola. Thanks for the inspiration again.
I miss you, my friend.
Yes. Hi. Two pragmatic short questions. Are there specific parameters an engaging story must answer to? And are they universal? For example, I've met a guy that was writing template constitutions for the United Nations, just in case a country needed them somehow. And the second question that leans against it is, are there intermediate stories that can keep the world afloat while an overarching story is being written? Because I think we're in a sort of a crisis situation with converging challenges that mask the opportunities a bit. And I was wondering whether there's an emergency kit to keep us afloat as well.
Okay, anyone else? Maybe
I think you should just go for it, Nikola, and
okay, I'll
just
try to go
give us a
quickly
few
as much
minutes
as I
to
can.
wrap everything together.
Yes, I'll try to go. So the first point was that the importance of power. I agree with it with one tweak. I think that's important. It's not about power, it's the power of story. Because money is not about power, but money is the most powerful story that humanity has ever had. Because even people who fundamentally disagree with each other about everything, like Osama bin Laden and the United States government, they both used to accept, Osama bin Laden, while he was alive, he used to accept US dollars as payments, which means that he disagrees with them on absolutely everything possible about how we should live, where we're coming from, and where we should be going as a civilization. Yet he accepted and embraced the story of money. And today, everywhere almost you go in the world, one version or another of money exists. So that's the most popular story of our civilization, money. Now, the distinction between the issues about arguing with people about values. And it goes both ways. So you can be a scientist trying to argue with a religious or spiritual person, or you could be a spiritual and religious person trying to argue with a scientist or a philosopher. And that's because very often both sides fail to notice the distinction, which is called facts and values distinction, or is versus ought distinction. So facts are facts, values are values, and you cannot derive a value out of a fact. At least I've never seen how it's done. You need the values in order to be able to interpret the meaning of the facts and give them a negative or a positive charge. So the values precede, facts follow. And the same is and ought. The same said in a different way is like, can you have an ought from an is? And the answer is, not to my knowledge. And that's a fundamental problem with that story I'm trying to write, because if the answer is yes, you can have an ought from an is, then it's much easier to write that story. If you can't, it's much harder, obviously. Hi, Cynthia. By the way, I agree with you about non-human animals. As you know, me and you agree, the future is vegan. I've been vegan now for 6 years. It's the best thing I've ever done for my life. In my life, I apologize for arguing with you so many times about how you shouldn't be vegan. And I think it's idiotic of me when I think in the past, but that's what growth is about, changing your story and embracing a new and better story, I think. And so the future is vegan, I'm convinced of that. And the explosion of Beyond Meat and all the alternative meats are kind of providing facts for our values shared now with you. So thank you for that. And I think more and more people are seeing that fact, by the way. The only thing we have to be careful is that we don't turn it into a religion, because all of us have gone through this zealot point where we become annoying assholes, pursuing people around us, trying to share or impose our own views. I'm not talking about you, I'm talking about me here. Okay, that was 5 years ago. Thank God I'm over now, because we change people better with our example, I've seen, than with our arguments. Okay, so the limits of story. Jens, great point. That's one of the chapters in part 3, the limits of story, just like the limits of mathematics. The limits of story are the limits of our civilization, because the universe may be created of stories as far as humans are concerned, but if you take out humans out of the equation, the universe doesn't have any stories. So there are limits to stories. But the story should be looked at whether it's useful or not useful to us and to our future. That's the value that I bring to a story, and how we should evaluate a good story versus a bad story. Does this story serve our future, or does it not? And if the answer doesn't serve our future, if that story doesn't serve the future, then it's not a good story in my books. And capitalism, as many of the old stories have played out their value, so they're no longer useful. On education, education is a story. Is a story that you accepted sometime long ago about what's the best way to live the good life. And our answer, and I accept that story in a big way, that, you know, by education we live the good life and we're better. But we shouldn't forget that this is a story, and there are religious people and other people who believe that, you know, following the God's word is the right way to live your life, and therefore you don't need more education than the holy book, and therefore that's sufficient. And we have to have space for those people in the future. I am proud to live in Ontario, where we have big groups of Mennonites living on farms, stuck with mid-19th century philosophy, riding around in horse buggies and using pneumatic power to power their farms. And I'm proud of the fact that our advanced Canadian society has carved out a space for those people to have the right to deny our technology and to live in at their own pace, in their own civilization, at their own level. We have to carve space for those people in the future too. Universal versus specific elements of the story. I think that was Sven. And sort of like temporary stories that can get us from here to there while we're waiting for the big story. Well, you see, and your friend who is writing a constitution, you see, that's an important attempt, because what is a constitution? The constitution is a story of a blueprint that regulates and frames how a group of people live together. And if you don't have that most basic understanding and acceptance of how we live together, we cannot live together in peace. It's like the blueprint at the most fundamental level. That's the Constitution, right? So it's a very important attempt. And so things like Constitution, but also things like the Golden Rule and other such minor stories, can help us get from here to there. Because the way, let's say, we want to be treated by the artificial intelligences in a kind, respectful, and peaceful manner. So we hope that if there's a world with artificial intelligence, they would not exterminate us or kill us for sport or put us in farms or in the zoo. But yet that's what we're doing to non-human animals all over the planet. And on our planet, every year we kill 73 billion animals and something like 1.3 trillion aquatic organisms. 1.3 trillion aquatic organisms annually. So think about, that's a genocide that you don't read in the story of our civilization. Why? Because the story of our civilization is written by the hunter, not by the lion. That's why. And so the emergency kit of story, and I'm going to wrap up on that. The emergency kit is a story that allows you to live peacefully and conflict and resolve conflict with people with whom you have diametrically opposed points of view. And as long as you can agree on a common story that contains the golden principle, that contains that treat others the way you'd like to be treated, and that goes across individuals, across nations, across gender, across transgender, across biological and artificial stratum, across animal kingdoms, and maybe across planetary boundaries. Only then can you have, you know, a 21st century flourishing of the human story that spans beyond the limits of our planet and goes to the stars.
Fantastic point to end on, Nikola. I can only thank you once again for being so generous with your time, your thoughts. Thank you to everyone for participating, for sharing your ideas. We didn't get permission from you up front to share the chat, so we're not going to do that. But in our follow-up email, we will share the list of links and authors and book titles and other things. We'll just capture that and share that with you, because I think that's a very useful resource that you've compiled through the course of this conversation. I will leave this webinar open for a few minutes. If anyone just wants to copy the chat, we'll leave that for you to do. I won't close it down straight away. But Nikola, thank you so much for giving up your time. I know it took a little bit of persuasion to get you to come on, and but I'm so glad that you did, because I think you've enriched us all. You've taken us on a fascinating story, if you like, through the notion of storytelling. I love the way you've weaved together so many of our different stories to help us understand what's working today and where the fractures are, but also to give us some sense of how we might navigate towards some new stories, if not a single one. So thank you again. And you'll see our notifications of forthcoming events. This is the first in a series around positive futures. You'll see more things coming, so please do join us for some of those. We have got one next week, I think it's the 25th, where we're looking at the potential for automation to actually enable good. How do we go beyond automation for profit towards automation, particularly around delivering on the Sustainable Development Goals? So we should have a fun half-hour chat about that one. See you all then. Thank you very much for coming. And as I say, I'll leave the conversation open for a few minutes so you can copy the chat if you want to.
Thank you, Rohit, and thank you everyone who came today. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Nicholas, and thank you, Rohit. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you all.